December 1944, Ardennes. A freezing fog grips the forest near Saint-Vith. American tank crews scan the tree line, tense, blind. Then thunder splits the silence. Shells scream, steel shatters, fire erupts. In just 20 minutes, Allied tanks are gone, ambushed by just 3 German Jagdpanthers, led by SS Oberleutnant Otto Carius, a master of armored warfare. These weren't just tanks. They were steel ghosts, fast, lethal, and crewed by men trained to kill with chilling precision. Their attacks weren't random. They were the sharp edge of a brutal machine doctrine that turned battles into executions. What made these machines, and their crews, so feared? How did they fight under pressure? And what finally brought their reign to an end? And to truly understand that fear, we first need to look at the monster that started it all. The Tiger I, birth of a predator. Panzer I and II, birth of the beast. To answer those questions, we have to go back. Before the thunder of Ardennes, before Kursk, before Normandy, before the world learned to fear the word Panzer. We go back to the early 1930s. Germany was still licking its wounds from the Great War. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed its military. Tanks were banned. The German army wasn't even allowed to call itself an army. But behind closed doors, the generals had other plans. In secret training camps hidden deep in Soviet territory, yes, the same Soviets they'd fight just years later, German officers and engineers studied tanks. They read British and French manuals. They tested old World War I designs, and eventually they began to draw up blueprints of their own. Out of these forbidden efforts came 2 machines, the Panzer I and Panzer II. The Panzer I looked more like a toy than a weapon. It had paper-thin armor, and instead of a cannon, it carried 2 machine guns. It couldn't stand up to a real tank. It wasn't built to. The Germans never intended to use it in actual war. It was a training tool, a rolling classroom for the new doctrine of fast, mechanized warfare. Still, when Hitler began rearming Germany in defiance of Versailles, the Panzer I became the first official tank of the Wehrmacht. Inside the tank, things were rough, cramped, stifling hot, deafening. There was barely enough room for the crew to turn their heads. Smoke from the engine mixed with gunpowder residue, and every bump in the road slammed their bodies against cold steel. It was brutal training, but it worked. Crews learned to move fast, think faster, and trust their machines. Then came Spain. In 1936, civil war broke out in Spain. Hitler sent German tank units to support Franco's fascists. It was the Panzer I's first taste of real war, and it wasn't pretty. The Panzer I went up against Soviet-supplied T-26 tanks. The T-26 had real armor, a real cannon. German crews quickly found out their machine guns were useless. Their shells bounced off like pebbles. Several Panzers were blown to pieces. Crews died screaming inside burning hulls. But this disaster turned into a turning point. Officers like Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of Germany's war arsenal, watched the reports closely. He saw the problem. Germany needed tanks that could not only move fast, but survive a fight. Tanks that could punch through enemy lines, not just roll beside them. Spain wasn't just a battleground. It was a laboratory, and the results were in. While Panzer I had opened the door, the Panzer II stepped cautiously through. Slightly larger, a little better armored, and with a 20mm autocannon that could finally take on light targets, it was still far from perfect. But it gave German designers and crews something to work with, and they worked fast. By the time Germany rolled into Poland in 1939, there were thousands of Panzer I and II tanks on the field. They were still lightly armed, still vulnerable, but now they were part of something new, a system, a doctrine, blitzkrieg, lightning war. Not just about tanks, but coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air support. The tanks didn't fight alone. They struck fast, found weak points, and broke through enemy lines while bombers screamed overhead and motorized troops poured in behind them. In Poland, the Panzer I and II helped prove the concept, but they also showed their limits. In head-on fights, they were still too weak. German commanders knew it. They pushed harder for better tanks, heavier, stronger, more deadly. But it wasn't just about armor and firepower. Inside each of those panzers were men. Young, often in their 20s. Many had never seen combat before Poland. They trained in simulators, learned to drive blindfolded, and practiced repairs in pitch dark. They memorized every bolt of their machines. They learned how to fire on the move, how to radio targets, how to survive. The crew inside a panzer was like a single body. One man drove, another loaded. One aimed and fired. The commander directed everything, scanning the horizon, issuing orders, keeping them alive. If one man failed, they all died. In Poland, they learned these lessons fast, too fast. Some tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Others broke down mid-battle. In some cases, Polish anti-tank crews managed to knock out panzers with Molotovs or horse-drawn artillery. It was clear, Germany had launched the war with tanks barely fit for the job. But they had momentum, and something else. Data. Real combat data. What worked, what didn't, what the crews hated, what they needed. Engineers back home took notes. They began drafting the next generation, and what came next would change warfare forever. The real beasts were about to be unleashed. Panzer III and IV, Blitzkrieg Titans. By late 1939, German industry had finally caught up with its ambition. The Panzer I and II had done their job, trained the crews, tested the ideas, exposed the flaws. Now it was time for the real thing, the Panzer III and Panzer IV. These weren't training tools or stopgaps. They were built for war, real war. The Panzer III was designed to kill other tanks. It had a 37mm cannon at first, later upgraded to a 50mm. It was faster, better armored, and had something that would become standard for all German armor: a radio in every tank. That changed everything. In earlier wars, tank crews used flags or hand signals to coordinate. With radios, they became a pack, moving, hunting, striking as one. The Panzer IV was meant to support the infantry. It carried a short-barreled 75mm gun, perfect for blasting bunkers and fortifications. But over time, it evolved. The gun got longer, the shells more powerful. It became the workhorse of the German armored force and one of the most produced tanks of the war. Together, the Panzer III and IV formed the steel fist of the Blitzkrieg. It started in Poland. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled across the border under the roar of Stuka dive bombers. The Polish army was brave, but outmatched. Many of their tanks were older designs. Their cavalry still fought on horseback. Within weeks, the country was cut in half, not just by German tanks, but by Soviet forces from the east. The world barely had time to react before the panzers struck again. In May 1940, Germany invaded France, but they didn't go through with the Maginot Line, the massive wall of French defenses. They went through the Ardennes forest, a place the French believed tanks couldn't pass. They were wrong. German armored divisions pushed through the dense trees in days. Fast, coordinated, relentless, and leading one of them, the 7th Panzer Division, was a general who would become legendary. Erwin Rommel. Rommel had never commanded tanks before France. He was an infantryman, but he adapted fast. His division moved so quickly, it vanished from German radio contact for days. They called it the Ghost Division. Not even Berlin knew where it was. In just 6 weeks, France collapsed. The French and British tanks weren't necessarily worse. In fact, many were heavier and more powerful. But they lacked one thing: communication. German crews could talk to each other. They could call in airstrikes. They could maneuver together. French tankers, on the other hand, often had to stop their tanks just so the commander could open the hatch and give orders. And the German crews were getting better. Men like Johannes Bülter, who later became a Knight's Cross recipient, got their start in Panzer IVs during these early campaigns. Others, like Hans Sandrock, a young Panzer III commander, described what it felt like to smash through enemy lines, gun blazing, engines howling. But it wasn't just speed or skill. There was a cold, ruthless efficiency to it. Tanks didn't just fight. They overwhelmed. They isolated pockets of resistance and bypassed strongholds. Towns were cut off before defenders even realized they were surrounded. French units would wake up to find German tanks behind them, radio towers down, roads blocked, supplies gone. It was shock and awe, and it seemed unstoppable. After France, Hitler turned his eyes to the Balkans and North Africa. In Yugoslavia and Greece, the panzers rolled again, often on roads little more than muddy goat trails. But it was in North Africa that the legend of the Panzer crew truly hardened. The desert was brutal. Sand clogged the engines, radiators overheated, crews cooked inside their metal boxes under the blazing sun. Water was rationed, fuel even more so. But Rommel, now commanding the Africa Corps, turned the desert into a killing ground. His Panzer III and I-4 units danced across the dunes. They ambushed British Crusader tanks, outflanked Matildas, and struck supply lines with precision. The British started calling him the Desert Fox. German tank crews in Africa became hardened professionals. They learned how to fight with limited supplies, how to hide in open ground, how to use terrain like a weapon. But even as they triumphed under the sun, something darker was brewing in the east. T34 Shock Crisis on the Eastern Front. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest land invasion in human history. Backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, the Wehrmacht expected a repeat of France, a fast, brutal collapse. At first, they got exactly that. Soviet lines shattered, towns fell in days, trainloads of prisoners were marched west. German officers sent reports home about easy victories. But the deeper they pushed into the vastness of Russia, through the forests of Belarus, across the fields of Ukraine, toward the cities of Smolensk and Kiev, they started encountering something unexpected. A new kind of tank. At first, reports were dismissed. Crews claimed that shells were bouncing off enemy armor. Some said the new Soviet tanks were faster than anything they'd seen. Others described them as invincible. Then, near the town of Mtsensk in October 1941, reality hit. General Heinz Guderian's 4th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored units in the Wehrmacht, was advancing through heavy forest and muddy roads when they were ambushed by Soviet T-34s. The German Panzer III and IV tanks, once dominant in Poland and France, couldn't penetrate the T-34's armor. Their shots bounced harmlessly off the sloped steel. And the T-34s? They returned fire with deadly precision. In that one engagement, the myth of German invincibility cracked. T-34s didn't just match German tanks, they surpassed them. They were faster, with powerful 500 horsepower diesel engines. Unlike German tanks that ran on gasoline and often caught fire when hit, the T-34s were more resistant to flames. Their wide tracks let them float over soft, muddy terrain where German tanks bogged down. But the real revolution was their sloped armor. It deflected shells that would have destroyed any Panzer III. And the gun, the 76.2mm cannon, could punch through German armor at a distance. German crews were stunned. Oberleutnant Hans Becker, a Panzer III commander, wrote in his diary after Mtsensk, We fired and fired. Nothing. They came at us like wolves. We lost 3 tanks in minutes. I saw one of ours hit a T34 directly. The shell sparked, then slid off. That's when I knew we were in trouble. The psychological shock was immense. Crews who had once felt unstoppable now approached battles with dread. Some even refused to engage T-34s without air support. General Guderian didn't mince words. After Metsensk, he reported directly to Berlin that German tanks were no longer superior. In fact, they were outclassed. He demanded that the German military capture a T-34 intact and rush it to engineers for study. The Germans complied. One was recovered, stripped apart, analyzed. And the verdict was clear. The T-34 was a masterpiece. It had flaws, primitive optics, rough welding, cramped interior, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that German shells couldn't kill it, and its gun could kill them. Even the mighty Tiger I, which wouldn't appear until the next year, was designed in part as a response to the T-34 threat. But back in late 1941 and early 1942, German tankers had no such luxury. They were stuck with what they had: Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and nerves of steel. Winter arrived early and brutal. Engines froze, oil thickened. German supply lines stretched and broke. In some units, tank crews slept inside their machines just to survive the cold. There were reports of crews lighting fires under the hulls to thaw the engines, and the Soviets weren't stopping. More and more T-34s rolled off the assembly lines. Fast, simple to build, easy to replace. German crews started calling them cockroaches for how many kept showing up. Tank battles became more savage. Often they weren't fought in open fields but in villages, forests, and city streets. It was close-range, brutal combat. In the ruins of Rostov and Rzhev, tanks clashed at point-blank range. Crews sometimes fired through walls or waited in silence for the clatter of enemy treads. It wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about survival. The Eastern Front broke many of Germany's best tank commanders, but it also forged legends. Men like Kurt Knispel, who would go on to become Germany's highest-scoring tank ace, began their rise in this crucible. At the time, he was just a gunner in a Panzer IV, watching the future of tank warfare roll past him and doing his best to stay alive. By early 1942, the message was clear. The Blitzkrieg had stalled. Germany's great armored gamble had hit a wall of steel and fire. The T-34 didn't just fight back, it rewrote the rules. German engineers rushed to respond. They pored over captured T-34s, took measurements, ran tests. What they needed now was something faster, stronger, and more modern. A predator that could meet the T-34 head-on and win. From this crisis, a new machine was born. A sleek, sloped killer with the heart of a lion and the nerves of a sniper. Panther, the perfect killer that always broke. The first Panthers rolled out at Kursk in the summer of 1943, during the largest tank battle in human history. The fields near Prokhorovka would see the debut. When the Panthers appeared, long-barreled, sleek, and imposing, they looked like the future. Their 75mm WW2 K-42 cannon could tear through Soviet armor from over a kilometer away. Their sharply sloped armor was built to deflect incoming fire. On paper, they were perfect. But paper lies. Of the 200 Panthers delivered before Kursk, 16 broke down during transport. More died before the first shot was fired. Engine fires, transmission failures, overheating. Just days into Operation Citadel, over half of the Panthers were already out of action. Crews were caught between admiration and frustration. They loved the firepower. When the gun fired, it was surgical. Clean. Deadly. Lieutenant Ernst Barkmann, a Panther commander in the 2nd SS Panzer Division, described it like being the eye of the storm. But too often, they never made it to the storm. One misstep, a clogged fuel pump or stripped gear, and the tank was stranded, helpless in a field of fire. And yet, when the Panther worked, it worked brutally. Its gun could destroy a T-34 before the Soviet crew even saw it. Its armor could absorb hits from nearly everything but the heaviest Soviet guns. When properly maintained, it was one of the deadliest machines on the field. But Kursk showed the cost. German crews suffered in ways no design could fix. The final drive was notoriously fragile. The engine was underpowered for its weight. Cooling systems failed in combat heat. Inside, crews baked, soaked in sweat and fumes. Shell casings clanged underfoot. The roar of the Maybach engine drowned out everything, except when it failed, and the silence came. In the Battle of Kursk, the Panthers had one job: lead the assault. Instead, dozens caught fire or broke down before they reached the enemy. Some were hit, others were abandoned. A few, just a few, fought brilliantly. The numbers tell the story. By the end of the first week, only about 10 Panthers were still operational. Yet still, tankers believed in the machine. After Kursk, Panther designs were improved, transmissions were upgraded, cooling was better. By 1944, Panther readiness rates on the Eastern Front climbed above 75%. Better, but not perfect. By Normandy, the Panther had matured into a true killer. In the open fields of France, it was feared by Allied tankers. British and American crews often reported that Sherman shells bounced off the Panther's front plate. In return, the Panther's gun punched straight through Allied armor. But even in the West, the same old ghosts haunted it. In hedgerow country, Panthers couldn't maneuver. Their length and narrow tracks made tight turns difficult. Allied air power tore up fuel convoys, and Panthers were left immobile in the mud. Still, the Panther left a legacy. It influenced post-war tanks across Europe and beyond. Its balance of firepower and armor became the standard. But in war, theory means little. And the Panther always carried its fatal flaw: fragility. Veterans like Barkman survived not just because of the tank, but in spite of it. They learned to feel the engine's mood, to recognize the warning signs of failure, to make their kills count, because the next ambush might leave them stranded. The Panther was a killer, but it was never invincible. It was fast, but not fast enough. Strong, but not strong enough. Built for victory, but often dying in retreat. And while German commanders demanded more Panthers, Hitler wanted something even larger, something thicker, heavier, and more terrifying. He wanted a monster, and so the next Panzer was born. Tiger and Tiger II, the heavy legends. Imagine moving through muddy fields, the earth trembling beneath a 50-ton machine, an engine roaring like a beast awake. That's the Tiger Y. Its armor was up to 100 millimeters thick. It carried an 88 millimeter cannon so powerful that it could destroy tanks from over a kilometer away. Painted in drab camouflage and led by skilled crews, these massive machines became the kings of the battlefield. The Tiger Y weighed twice as much as a Panzer IV, yet with nearly 45 kilometers per hour top speed, it wasn't sluggish. Inside, the driver and radio operator sat up front. 3 more men cramped into the turret: commander, gunner, and loader. Though more spacious than earlier Panzers, it was no luxury. The roar of the engine, the smell of burning fuel and gunpowder, and the tension of every round fired filled the cramped space. One crew member stood out: SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann. In June 1944, near Villers-Bocage in Normandy, his Tiger emerged down a narrow lane of hedges. British armor lay ahead. With nerves of steel, he fired. Within 15 minutes, he destroyed 13 to 14 enemy vehicles, including tanks, personnel carriers, and guns. His Tiger was hit, but not destroyed. He drove it into cover. Wittmann's kill streak became legend, though propaganda likely inflated the numbers. Still, his skill under fire was real. The Tiger's main armament, The 8.8cm K-36 was deadly. British tests showed it could hit a 4-foot target 5 times in a row at 1,200 yards. Inside, crews carried 4 types of ammo: high explosive, incendiary, armor-piercing, and tungsten core. But shooting such a massive gun took time. 1 shot, then 6 to 16 seconds of reloading. Long seconds when shells are flying back at you. Building a Tiger demanded industrial muscle. Powered by a nearly 700 horsepower Maybach engine with heavy suspension and wide tracks, it was engineering marvel. But each one cost twice as much as a Panzer IV. Only 1,047 Tiger IIs were built, alongside about 492 Tiger IIs. Compared to the tens of thousands of lighter tanks, every Tiger was hugely valuable. Driving a Tiger was a mark of elite status. Tank crews trained longer, survived brutal exercises, and developed unconditional trust in their machines. But as much as pride lifted their spirits, loneliness weighed heavily. A Tiger worked best alone or in small teams. In big battles, they were often surrounded. Allied air raids forced them to operate at night. One loader, Herbert Jaeger, described driving over a destroyed bridge under blackout conditions. One misstep, and the tank would tumble into the abyss. When the Allies demanded more armor, Hitler demanded even more. Enter the Tiger II, also called the King Tiger. Its armor reached 180 millimeters, sloped at angles to deflect shots. It carried a more modern 88mm gun with greater armor-piercing capability, but heavier meant slower and less reliable. On paper, it was nearly invincible. In reality, it was fragile. In France after D-Day, Tigers sliced through Allied columns. Yet British Shermans armed with 17-pounder guns, nicknamed Fireflies, could pierce their armor from long range. Allied air power tore apart fuel convoys and supply lines. Soon, Tigers could not move. Without fuel or spare parts, even the heaviest armor couldn't save them. Still, wherever Tigers appeared, Allied tankers feared them. They called them beasts and royal Tigers. Survivors like Otto Carius, credited with destroying more than 150 enemy tanks, became war celebrities. As the war ground on, new challenges pressed in. Manufacturing delays, pilot shortages, and a steady loss of air cover forced Tigers back behind defensive lines. Crews often found themselves firing from cover, digging foxholes around their turrets like stationary bunkers. Despite the pressure, Tiger crews kept fighting. They were engineers, radio operators, loaders, and drivers, all packed into a massive steel shell that was part home, part war machine, part coffin. They pressed ahead, even when fuel was low, even when medical aid was days away. And so as the war dragged into winter and beyond, German tank commanders began asking, what kind of tank could blend power, protection, speed, and reliability without draining the nation's dwindling resources? As always, the Germans came up with a solution: Stooge 3 and Jagd series, the ambush masters. In 1943, as supply lines frayed, factories bombed, and crews ran thin, Germany still needed ways to kill enemy tanks. But with fewer Panther and Tiger machines, they needed something that could strike hard and disappear, something simpler, cheaper, and stealthy. That's where tank destroyers came in. The most famous was the Sturmgeschütz III, or Stooge 3. It used the Panzer III's chassis, but instead of a turret, it had a fixed gun mounted low in a casemate. This made it shorter, flatter, and harder to spot, in perfect hiding tanks. Instead of wasting metal and time on rotating turrets, German engineers focused on a powerful, forward-facing 75mm gun. It was enough to punch through most Allied tanks at medium range and easier to produce. Over 10,000 Stooge 3s rolled out between 1940 and 1945. The Stooge 3 was simple. It cost less than a Panther, used fewer parts, and took less time to build. That meant more machines on the battlefield. It wasn't flashy or legendary, but it was everywhere. On the Eastern Front, North Africa, Italy, and right here in Normandy. Inside a Stoogie 3, the crew was packed tight. Driver, gunner, loader, and commander were forced to rely on each other completely. The commander had no cupola. He peered out a small hatch and spoke directly to the loader. No radio needed in most cases. Silence was the rule. Stay hidden, wait for targets, fire, and vanish. Hunters, not fighters. They became experts in camouflage. Crews painted their tanks in forest green and brown, added branches to the brush guards, and parked in ditches. They stayed absolutely still. German commanders drilled them. If they see you first, you lose. Stoogie crews earned the nickname ambush masters. They struck from forests, ruins, hedgerows, and hills. They were deadly. In 1944, during the Normandy campaign, a single Stoogie 3 battalion reportedly knocked out over 300 Allied tanks and self-propelled guns. We don't know the exact crews, but their patience and discipline saved towns from falling. Then came the Jagd Panther. It was built on the Panther chassis, but heavy armored and without a turret. Like the Stoogie 3, it had a long, fixed 88mm gun. It brought the power and armor of the Panther into a stealthier package. It weighed 45 tons and had armor thick enough to shrug off most Allied fire. Only about 415 were built between early 1944 and early 1945. Few, but deadly. Crews called them Panther killers. One true story comes from Normandy in July 1944. A unit of Jagd Panthers crept into a wooded area and set an ambush for an advancing American Sherman column. They fired first, then retreated behind trees before the Americans could form a defense. They destroyed 17 Shermans in an hour. No survivors, no enemy return fire. That's what they were built for. Their success depended on crew skill. These weren't flashy warriors. They were patient hunters. They spent hours waiting in freezing wet fields, coated in mud and tangled vegetation. They cracked open canned food in the rain, all while straining for sound and movement. One faint engine noise, one flicker of metal, and they struck. Then came the Jag Tiger. Built on the Tiger II hull, it had a massive 128mm gun, the most powerful fielded in World War II. It could destroy any Allied tank from almost any distance. It was thickly armored and nearly invincible head-on, but there were only about 88 of them ever produced. They were huge, nearly 70 tons, and painfully slow. Many couldn't cross bridges, got stuck in mud, or broke down on the way to battle. Jagdtigers saw action late in the war, mostly on the Eastern Front. They punched massive holes through Soviet columns, but many were lost to mechanical failure. One vehicle might knock out several T-34s in a single push, but it might stall the next day and be left behind. Inside these destroyers, the crews knew the dangers. A breakdown didn't just mean being late. It meant being easy prey. Tigers, Panthers, and Jag Tigers couldn't hide forever. Allied planes, artillery, or infantry could trap them. Once spotted, they were targets. Normandy in 1944 was a nightmare. Massed Allied air power meant that supply roads were bombed, fuel was scarce, and spare parts hard to find. A broken Jagd Panther might sit months before being repaired. Crews lived in dugouts behind their vehicles, shivering and hungry, watching the skies for Allied bombers. Yet, despite the hardships, they held defensive lines. Not by brute strength, but by discipline, surprise, and determination. A single Jagd Panther could hold a hedgerow, keeping dozens of Sherman tanks pinned in place, all by firing 3 deadly shots and then ducking back into cover. Tank aces rose from these ranks too. Otto Carius, a Tiger ace later credited with over 150 kills, also commanded Jagd Panthers. His memoirs described the quiet intensity of ambush fighting, the crushing weight of responsibility, and the sharp fear of death. He wrote that one Jagd Panther saved an entire town until it was surrounded and destroyed by artillery. He walked away alone. The ambush masters were powerful, but they were also shadows. They could not rescue German defenses alone, because by now, even the best tanks couldn't save a dying Reich. Collapse. The final ride. By late 1944, the proud panzer divisions were running on fumes. Literally, Allied bombers had shattered the factories. Oil fields were gone. Trains were ambushed. There was no fuel, no replacement parts, and almost no trained crews left. Inside the tanks, teenagers took the seats of dead veterans. They had barely learned to drive, let alone fight. In some units, commanders scrawled orders on scraps of paper because radios were gone. Mechanics cannibalized broken tanks just to keep a few rolling. At the Silo Heights in April 1945, Germany's final armored defenders made their last stand. Soviet guns thundered for days. Tigers and Panthers fired from hilltops, but they were too few. In Berlin, tanks didn't maneuver. They waited, buried in rubble, firing from street corners like bunkers. Some crews blew up their machines before surrendering. Others never made it out. In those final days, tanks once feared across continents became steel tombs. Crews either died inside or were pulled out in surrender. The battlefield was littered with smoking hulls, burnt-out panzers, split open and silent. This wasn't a war of maneuver anymore. It was collapse. But the machines weren't the scariest part. It was the men inside them. The war ended, the engines stopped, but something lingered. For the men who drove these tanks, they were more than metal. They were heat, noise, smoke, fear. They were killing machines, shelters, prisons. Some crews lived, some burned alive. Most were never named. The world remembered the tanks, the Tigers, the Panthers, but the myth came at a price. The Reich is gone. The steel has rusted. But the memory? The memory still rolls forward, one haunted track at a time.